Even I never realized how cut and dry this was and how much it didn't have to do with me giving 10% of my money, period, end of story. If you stop tithing today, you'll have more money to work with. Your bills will get paid a little bit faster and a little bit easier. You might be able to afford to have just some semblance of lifestyle. What rules are you breaking if you decide that you're going to keep your money and do something better with it? Well, you're not breaking any law that was devised by any God, and certainly not Yahweh. This is not something that anyone has ever been required to do in this form.
Welcome to Unbound,
A podcast for new atheists,
and lifetime atheists,
ex-evangelicals,
truth seekers, and free thinkers.
There is life after faith.
And life here is good. It's time for a new perspective.
And a better conversation. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle. And it's time to get unbound.
Welcome to another episode of Unbound. I'm Spider.
And I'm Shelle.
And we are going to just forego the whole Christians behaving badly thing again and get right into our main topic this time, because I think it's an important one, especially if you're still in this environment and this is something that you've been pressured into more than once. And I know that we were pressured into it quite a bit and on levels that most people aren't.
No.
And we're talking about the subject of tithing and some of the common misconceptions that the average pastor has about this, especially the fact that it has anything to do with money, which it really does not. And we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of what tithing was in the Bible and what it wasn't, so that you know whether or not you are doing your spiritual duty by giving 10% of your income to the church. I think by the time we're done, you're going to have more than enough information in your hands to be able to make the right decision about this and hopefully start saving some of that money for yourself. Because with all due respect, God doesn't want your money, or at least that's the message in the Bible.
Right. Every
single time the subject of tithing comes up, God doesn't really want your money. The whole business of tithing was about something completely different. And before I jump the gun and get halfway into the story before we even start, I want to share just a little bit of my experience with this particular subject. Now, one of the worst examples that I saw of this was when we were getting ready to go full on into the Assemblies of God, and I was going through the interview process.
Right.
And this actually, it started a little bit earlier than this, because the first person that I remember talking to about this and the illogical nature of it was probably the exact wrong person I should have been talking to, because one of the things that was made clear to me during my senior year was that if I was going to be working within the Assemblies of God, I was going to be required to tithe to not my local church, but to the general council, which never sat right with me. The whole idea of putting a monetary value on what I choose to give never sat well with me. But you know what? I obeyed the tithing rule for a while, for a long while, and always felt guilty when I didn't give. And let me tell you, they pass that plate around a lot. Even in churches that don't pass the plate, there's a heavy emphasis on giving.
Yeah.
And not just your tithes. They want you to go above and beyond. And the conversation that I had with this guy at Valley Forge, it was kind of scary. It was very scary. When he described how he manages his giving, he claimed, now it was a claim, but I found this guy to be pretty trustworthy. So if he said that he was doing this, I didn't have any reason to believe that he wasn't. And he started going over all the ways that he gave to the local church, that he gave to the general council, that he did everything that he was supposed to do. And it amounted to not 10% of his income, but on average, it was about 30% that he was giving away. Well, you know what? That's okay if you can afford it. But most of the people I know can't.
Right.
And the notion of giving away that kind of a huge chunk, now you're thinking it's only 10 cents on the dollar, but that's $10 for every 100, that's $100 for every 1,000. It adds up, and it adds up quickly. And it was painful for me to write those checks, because I know that I could have used that money better. I could have put it to better use. And with all due respect, it could have kept the wolves from gathering around our door more than once.
Right.
And when I think about the sheer amount of money that I just sent off to these people, not the General Assembly, we never got that far, but the sheer amount of money that I gave to whatever church we were going to and whatever things they were involved in, I know that we'd be a little bit further ahead of things if I hadn't given away so much of my money when I was younger. But I was one of those that was kind of gung-ho also. I was always generous. And when it was asked, I always tried to find a way to give something. I also found it very uncomfortable when they passed the plate and I wasn't in a position to give at that moment because it always felt like all eyes were on me at that point. And I wasn't the only one that felt that way. So the guilt about not giving, it's put in there in a real subtle way, but it's definitely put in there. And the guilt over not giving above and beyond your tithe sometimes is even worse because the tithe is required, but giving comes more from the heart. Right. Giving sacrificially comes more from the heart. So you're not just obeying a rule, you are helping out in a way that goes above and beyond that. Well, here's the funny part about that. That second part, the free will offering part of the equation, is actually the only real biblical part of any of this. The whole idea of giving money was never part of any biblical model. It always revolved around goods. It revolved around agriculture. It revolved around livestock. But it almost never revolved around money. And we're going to get into some specifics about this. And oddly enough, the best resource that I found on this was actually a book that was written by a theist, but one with a little bit of personal integrity who wanted us to know that, this really isn't something that's required of us today. And certainly not in the way that it's managed. So it's from a book called The Tithing Dilemma by Ernest L. Martin. And there will be a link to this in the show notes, and I definitely recommend taking a look at it. I mean, let's forget that this guy is a theist, and let's take a look at what he has to say, because guess what? I'm gonna give you a little bit of a shock here, but they're not always wrong. There are times when you run into one that actually knows how to think and actually wants things to be right. And I mean, as right as you can be when you're using the Bible as the basis of anything. But this is a very, very practical analysis of what tithing is and what it isn't. And I definitely recommend having a look at it. And it's one of those situations where you're going to have to kind of chew on the meat and spit out the bones, because there is a lot of theistic crap in there too. But at the same time, he's really looking at this from the standpoint of law. What is required of you in this instance? And he looks at it in what I consider to be a real lawyerly and secular way, but with the biblical references and biblical proofs just sort of tossed in there to emphasize the point. But this guy did his research. And the bottom line is that tithing with money was never the way that this system was supposed to work. Now, I've got a lot prepared on this, and I'm looking at my co-host sitting across the table with not a whole heck of a lot to say. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Like, what kind of pressures were put on you, especially when you were younger?
Yeah.
Because this started when I was a teenager. And what am I making at that point working at McDonald's? But I was pressured to give, and I was pressured to give above and beyond. Were there any early examples of this that you can remember?
Well, I was raised Episcopal, so they did that, but it was more like, okay, here's the tithing envelopes, and then they didn't really stress it very much, especially with kids. I mean, you don't have money. Your parents have money and they give you money. And I didn't really have a job as a teenager. So it wasn't a thing, but it was, because you were expected to put in whenever they passed the plate. I mean...
And it was uncomfortable when you didn't.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I honestly, when I look back now, I don't think that anybody around me, especially my age, really cared.
Yeah.
but I also knew that I was being looked at as the example.
Right.
So when that offering plate came my way and I had nothing to put in it, it was embarrassing. I mean,
Yeah.
there was a point in time where I always made sure I had a buck in my pocket.
Right.
So that I could just sort of fold it up. So you don't know if it's a 5, a 10, or a 20 or anything like that.
Right.
It's just money and it's
Yeah.
going in there.
Yeah.
And I got real used to just having that emergency dollar in case there was a surprise offering. And there were a lot of surprise offerings.
There's always a surprise offering, and they're not a surprise because they just, every day, every time you gathered, you took an offering.
Right. But I'm talking more about the stuff where, the church needed something.
Oh, yeah.
Or somebody was coming in and, or they brought in entertainment. Those traveling
The traveling
musical
evangelists.
families and evangelists
yes.
and whatnot. Yeah, I'm talking more about that.
Oh, yeah.
Where they would pressure you into giving above and beyond your tithe to help out in whatever way they needed you to help out that week. And even the one church where I actually had a title did this I think it was their HVAC system
Yeah.
that needed an overhaul.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and I can remember being browbeaten about this from the pulpit for weeks on end and being pressured to give above and beyond the 10% that I was already giving them. I'm actually amazed. Given the way that these people were, I'm actually amazed that they didn't ask me for pay statements to make sure that I was giving my full tithe.
Yeah.
Because that's a thing that some churches will do, especially if you work for them. Because with all due respect, they can't pay you without knowing they're going to get something back. So when you work in a church as a pastor or in some kind of support role, it's expected right then and there that you're going to start tithing to the local church. So when you look at what they're willing to pay you, just lob 10% off of it and 10% off the top. Mm-hmm. Okay? Not after taxes or anything else like that. I can remember my grandmother asking our senior pastor one time whether or not it was expected to tithe off of your net or your gross. And the answer that she got was, well, do you want a net blessing or a gross blessing? Mm. And that's the other part of it. Did you ever have someone try and pressure you into that and then tell you, but you know what, it's going to come back to you threefold or sevenfold, or if they were really bold, tenfold? Anybody ever do that to you?
Not me personally. It was just sort of a group thing. They would say it from the pulpit like all the time. Televangelists do that too. They do that all the time.
But that's a different thing than the local church. The local church is a little bit more subtle about it, and they're a little bit less aggressive.
Yes.
But, I mean, depending on where you were and who was talking, it was always about the return on investment. There was always a promise that you would somehow get that money back, or that things would get worked out where you wouldn't have to spend the money, but it would come back to you. We were always promised that it would come back. And I preached this concept quite a bit myself and was able to give what I considered to be proofs, because there were certain things that happened along the way. There were certain bills that got paid. There were times when I looked at what money we had left at the end of a pay period, and it was a little bit more than average. And of course, I had to equate that with, well, I'm being good about my tithe, and it's coming back to me.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what's happening. Mm-hmm. When you give that tithe, what your brain starts doing is figuring out how it's going to get stuff done without that 10%.
Yeah.
So it has nothing to do with God giving anything back. It's about, now you're not going to stop at Starbucks today. And you're not going to buy your lunch. You're going to bag your lunch. Right. And you're going to start making certain changes to account for that money that is no longer there. So you're not getting anything back. You're just making smarter choices with the money that's left. Mm-hmm. And some would argue that that makes tithing a good idea because it teaches you how to manage your money. Well, guess what? I can learn how to manage the 100% just as well. Yes. So why do I need to lose that chunk of my income to learn how to manage my money?
Right.
I mean, it's important that you learn how to manage your money anyway. So why add in the stress of, okay, I make this much, but I only have this much? And it's even less when you are in a church that insists that you tithe on your gross. I got news for these people. I never did. It's like, I tithed on my net and I tithed on my tax return.
Right.
Because that was the money that I had coming in. And if anybody wanted to challenge me on that, then I would have just asked them for book, chapter, and verse that says anything about gross versus net, because these concepts did not exist in the Bronze Age. They just did not. So I'm curious, are there any specific examples where you felt like you were pressured to give your tithe, aside from the social pressure? Was there anything that you can remember from that time, even in college? Because I know they did this to us a lot.
Oh, they did this to us in college all the time. And that was really hard because a lot of times they're saying, oh, this person, one of your classmates, is going to the mission field. And, we need to give them a love offering so that they can go over. And that, you want to give them money.
Well, yeah.
Because they're your friends and you know them.
Right. So in school, it wasn't so much about tithing, but it was about all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And they made it very, very clear what our responsibilities were going to be. Mm-hmm. And they made sure that they got us into the habit of doing it, even if it meant giving it to them. But none of that has a whole lot to do with tithing. I want to get into the above and beyond giving when we're done with this, but I want people to understand what tithing was actually about in the Old Testament. So the real tithe of the Bible is, in fact, biblical law. But then again, just like it says in the book, so are things like animal sacrifices and circumcision and things that we don't require anymore. So why is this required? Because there's a tangible benefit to somebody. The funny thing about this whole business of tithing is the way that it has evolved into being all about money, when in its beginning it had nothing to do with money. So the first thing to understand about this is that, number one, the Bible is very, very clear that there was only one group of people that was supposed to tithe. And this is the pre-Mosaic law, okay? The Israelites were the only ones who were required to pay a tithe, and they were only required to pay it to the Levites. So if you were an Israelite, you were under obligation if you met certain criteria. And it usually meant that you were a farmer, that you were a rancher, that you were someone that produced things that kept people alive, okay? Even things like textiles, some types of jewelry, they were just other things that were more important, or much more important than money, especially when you're in a situation where you don't have a whole lot of need or reason to spend money. And the other part of that equation was that when the Israelites were wandering in the desert, it wasn't like they were establishing farms and large animal breeding operations that were sedentary, that were all in one place. So it was difficult to gauge what people should be giving for a tithe. And there came a point where Moses just basically resigned himself to the fact that there was nothing else that certain people who were required to pay this tithe could do except give money. But it was one of those last resort sort of things that they would collect money from somebody. Usually, it was insisted that if you were a producer, that you brought a certain percentage of what you produced into the temple for distribution to people who had less. And that was, it was a way of making sure that everyone survived their wilderness wanderings and it was actually a smart thing to do. It was kind of the foundation for communal living, and there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But when it's done correctly and everyone's needs are met, then it actually works out well. It almost never works out that way.
Yeah.
But when it does, it's a good system. So the Bible does actually set up an okay system here, but just like anything else, it never goes into any real detail about anything that doesn't benefit Yahweh.
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of things that you need to do when you're giving sacrifices. There are things that are done to prepare the sacrifice. There are certain things that are done at certain times of year. And all of this was to placate Yahweh. Well, now that we're talking about something that's supposed to benefit the people, so the bottom line is that the tithe was not supposed to be paid by everybody, And there are different things said throughout the Old Testament about what tithing is. Like, a lot of evangelicals will say that the concept of tithing begins in the book of Genesis. Well, sorry, Ken Ham, but the answer is not in Genesis this time. But there is a first mention in Genesis 14 about tithing. And the context of the statement here has absolutely nothing to do with what is outlined in Levitical law, starting in Leviticus 27. Incidentally, in the first Levitical description of tithing, we're hearing about amounts of product in the 1/500th category, certainly not 1/10. So it was never a requirement until later that the tithe be something that was practically sacrificial in nature. It was a matter of giving what you could. And that really was the way that it was done for many, many years, almost 2,000 years. It was done that way. And it was always a voluntary thing until Mosaic law. Under Mosaic law, there were specific requirements to what the tithe should be, who should give the tithe, and all of that. It was a lot more free form before that. And it was usually voluntary. There was more of a personal angle to it, and honestly, more of a selfish angle to it than what your average pastor will tell you what tithing is these days. Because the ones that, and it actually in some instances turned into a little bit of a competition as to who could give more. So, and it was good because there was always excess, but it really didn't help improve interpersonal relations with people when you were competing with them over who was going to give more back into the community. Another instance here in Genesis 28 actually talks about a 20% tithe. But this was something that was imposed by Pharaoh. At that point, we're talking about 20%. A 20% tithe, but that was also down from 100 because this was something that was negotiated to make sure that the Israelites still had what they needed, because there was a period of time when the Egyptians allegedly, because we're talking all about stuff that's in the Bible here, so let's look at it from the standpoint of narrative. And in this point in the narrative, the Egyptians are placing some heavy demands on the Israelites. So a compromise is reached. 20% seems to be the going rate to give to Pharaoh. But this is also, and during this time and during the Exodus, we start seeing the concept of free will offerings. Getting back to the beginnings, the first page turnings of this concept, and what evangelical ministers and churches use as their foundation, it's shaky. It is shaky, to say the least. And honestly, I have to wonder whether or not these people have ever read any of these verses, or if they were simply told that these verses are about tithing, and then they just sort of memorize them without thinking about precisely what it's saying. Because they'll focus on the fact that certain amounts are talked about, but they tend to gravitate away from the fact that this had nothing to do with money. And it just keeps coming back to this. In my head, as I'm reading this, I'm dumbfounded. Not that I hadn't heard about any of this before, because I've heard this argument before, but I never realized, and I have to admit, that even I never realized how cut and dry this was, and how much it didn't have to do with me giving 10% of my money, period, end of story. The Bible only ever mentions two types of income that were tithable, okay? Aside from the concessions that were made for those that were not producing, and from whom Moses decided it was okay to take some money in a pinch, there are only two things that were tithable. One was agricultural products, and the other was livestock.
Right.
Okay? So you were supposed to bring a 10th portion of whatever you produced, not whatever money you made, okay? Because back then, there was a lot of bartering going on. People didn't have salaries like they did today, but there was still money, and it still made it into the top 1%'s hands. And those top 1%ers got away with it because they weren't really producing anything, so they just gave a little bit that honestly didn't make any impact on their lifestyle. For the average person today, 10% is a huge chunk of their income. Mm-hmm. It is a strain, and it is a problem, and it can cause financial problems for them to keep up with their tithes. And there are some people that will just keep giving and giving and giving because they've been told that they'll see a return on investment that's 3, 7, or 10-fold. I think that there are shady biblical references for all of those numbers, but I think that a lot of times the higher numbers are just used to boost decisions to give more.
Right.
And to make decisions to tithe. I remember being in one church that actually, and they said that it was voluntary, but I can remember being asked to sign a contract that said that I would tithe to the church. Because if I say that I'm going to do it, and now I know that someone's expecting it, it's more likely that I'm going to do it.
Right.
And it really, really treads closely to the way the Mormons do things. And I will get into that in just a little bit toward the end. But I'm once again going to defer to shows like How to Heretic that are more in line with Mormon teachings. They understand it more because they came out of it. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit toward the end. But if you really want to get an idea of what that particular church organization does with its money, there was a recent episode from them on this also, where they talk about this massive stockpile of money that the Mormon church has access to that is literally just sitting there, that could solve a multitude of problems, not just here in the States, but in the world in general. And they are not letting go of it. Not only do they not let go of it, but they also have very strict requirements on the people who call themselves Mormon to pay these tithes, and they make sure that you pay. Most churches are not quite that, they're not quite that aggressive, which is good, because I don't know how much more stress I could have handled trying to figure out how I was going to do without that 10% and still pay my bills. And with all due respect, the answer to that for a while was that we couldn't, and that we were getting some help. We got some help from my grandmother for several years paying our rent, and it made it a little bit easier to pay my tithe. But you know what? I always felt guilty when I got that check from her.
Yeah.
I always felt guilty about not tithing on that.
Yeah.
Because with all due respect, it's income, isn't it? And I think that a couple of times I actually did feel, quote unquote, convicted enough to add that extra $20.
Yeah.
And there were times when I just felt like I wasn't doing everything that I should be as a Christian, as a youth leader, pastor. They didn't even really want to give me a title. So, whatever I was called, I was still expected to do this. And believe me, the people in that church, they were watching. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I'm amazed that they never asked to see a pay stub to make sure I was giving it all.
Yeah.
But fortunately, that never happened. So being that the Bible only sanctions 2 types of things that you should be tithing on, where does that leave us in the modern day? Well, it leaves a lot of us in the same position that these people who only had money to tithe with, who weren't producing anything that was going to be a benefit to the community. It kind of comes down to that, because most of us have jobs where we collect paychecks at this point. So it's a lot easier for us to simply write a check, but it's not easy on the wallet, and it's not easy on the bills. And if you read what the Bible says about tithing carefully, then it becomes very clear that this is not something that anyone, Jew, Christian, or anywhere in between, has ever been required to do in this form. There were Mosaic laws about tithing. So I'm reading directly from the book here. Moses finally came to the conclusion that a tithing system was necessary for the nation of Israel. This occurred at the beginning of the 2nd year of the Exodus. He told the Israelites that they should henceforth give a 10th part of their seed crops and fruit trees, plus every 10th animal to the treasury in the newly erected tabernacle. That comes from Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 through 33. The one part that I find real interesting here, remember how they used to talk to us about our tithes being the first fruits?
Right.
Well, that's not what this says here, is it?
No.
What it says here is every 10th animal. Okay? So that to me doesn't sound like first fruits.
No.
Now, the argument here is that you can't give the first because you have to keep breeding and producing more.
Right.
So in this instance, it makes a whole lot more sense for the tithe to come from the back end and not the front end.
Right. That makes sense.
Right. But there are so many more abstract versions of this that come down to people just simply giving what they could afford. It made sense to me, instead of lobbing it off the top, to see what's left at the end of the week and see what I can comfortably and cheerfully give to the church.
Right.
Because the Lord loves a cheerful giver. And I never gave my tithe very cheerfully, which was another thing that made me wonder whether or not this was something that I really should be doing.
Right.
Because if it doesn't feel good, then, I mean, I've been told multiple times that the Lord loves a cheerful giver. If I can't give it cheerfully, should I still be giving it? Well, of course, the answer is yes, because that's the answer that benefits the person answering the question.
Right.
But it has nothing to do with anything that the Bible says. The Bible, in multiple places, says that your quote-unquote tithe or your giving should be based on what you are comfortable giving. So the 10% thing is incredibly arbitrary, and there is no real basis for it, even in Scripture, even in Malachi. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes, because that's the one verse that they use to make sure that you continue tithing and that you tithe 10%, because there is a verse in Malachi that outlines that concept pretty black and white. Still, there are problems that we will get to with that in just a couple of minutes. There was one exception to the Levitical rule, and that was in Leviticus 27:31, that says, if a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it the fifth part thereof. Again, quoting from the book, in other words, if a man for various reasons did not wish to pay his tithe in kind, and he wished to give money as a substitute, he was penalized a fifth part. So basically, there was, what's the word I'm looking for here? There was a penalty. It's right there. There was a penalty for paying with money as opposed to paying with something that people could use, because money was of real the worth, not the worth so much of money, because it was worth what it was worth, but the usefulness of it.
Right.
At certain times and in certain contexts was iffy. So it really wasn't benefiting anyone. It was just sort of sitting there until it was needed. And there was a lot of money that just sat there for a long time. The Mormons weren't the first ones to do this, although the amounts were definitely less because it was not the preferred method. But there was a lot of money that was collected, and they just didn't know what to do with it because there was nothing to do with it at that moment. So they're collecting these tithes, and now what do we do with them? Well, we can't feed people with them, and we can't do this and that. This, again, is the author talking about, how the rules changed in the New Testament. And because he's a theist, he's talking about the atonement and saying that because Christ did what he did, that we don't have to worry about anything that happened in the Old Testament anyway. And there are only a couple of times where tithing is even mentioned in the New Testament. And again, we're talking about things like meats and drinks, diverse washings, carnal ordinances, and that was all in Hebrews chapter 9. All of that is gone over in the book of Hebrews, and it's another place where they find evidence that tithing was something that the early church was supposed to be doing. It really wasn't. There were a few militant sects out there, and honestly, that one part in the book of Acts with Ananias and Sapphira,
Right.
Okay, because they didn't give everything that they were supposed to give, then this is your loving God at work. This is your loving God at work, okay? Because they withheld a little bit for their own comfort. The Holy Spirit slayed them,
Yes.
killed them, okay? That sounds more like something that the mafia would do. All right? It doesn't sound like something that a loving God would do. It sounds like the way Tony Soprano would deal with you. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the actions of a loving God, and it certainly doesn't sound like the actions of a comforter. Wasn't the Holy Spirit supposed to be a comforter,
Yes.
not a killer? But here he is playing right off of his nature, because if he is part of the Trinity, then he is ostensibly Yahweh. And what does this monstrosity of a God do when he has a problem with anyone? He doesn't try to work it out with them. He doesn't approach them as any sane father would. No. You disobeyed me, fuck you, you're dead.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the way that he dealt with a lot of things in the Old Testament. It was either, I'm going to kill him, or you're going to kill him. There was so little middle ground here. There were no real primary solutions. There were no provisions for trying to set things right. It was just, okay, you did this. All right, so kill him. You gathered sticks on the Sabbath. Kill him. You were a teenager and you sassed your parents. Kill him. This is the way that this loving God deals with everything.
Right.
So when it comes down to what we're supposed to do as Christians, I don't know about you, but I know a lot of Christians who don't tithe. And I've never seen anyone smited down in the middle of church.
No.
Because someone confronted them about whether or not they paid their tithe and they lied about it. I don't see this happening today.
No.
But that verse was in there as a warning. And it was also put in there as a means of helping the powers that be gain and maintain a foothold with this. Because they'll pull those verses out and talk about robbing God. Have you ever heard?
Yeah.
You ever heard that phrase?
Yes.
About how if you're withholding your tithe, you're actually robbing God.
Yeah.
Oh, the other one that I really liked. I don't know if you remember this one, but there was that church down in Philly that we went to, that real wild church with the guy that always seemed coked up. And as it turned out, he actually was.
Yeah.
He was a crack addict who was running a ministry in the middle of Philadelphia, and he had a huge ministry. And that was where that big roving Sunday school was.
Oh, I remember it.
I won't say the name of that one because I have no idea what's going on in that church now, if it's still there, who's running it, and what kind of shape it's in. But all I know is that this guy came to Valley Forge at one point, and he spoke in chapel, and he was very charismatic, and I caught the bug. And I thought that it would be fun to work with him. And we actually, that was our church for quite a while, but they didn't have an evening service, and that's where I lost deportment points because I didn't want to go to Vespers. I didn't want to go to the campus service. So I lost a lot of points, but I was doing a lot of work. So I was being penalized for actually being there for most of the day. There were times where we didn't come back until 4 or 5 o'clock anyway.
Right.
So I feel like I had put in my time. And I didn't want to have to go running back off to another service less than an hour later after an entire day of working with these kids and going to service, which always went long because this was another guy who really loved the sound of his own voice. And when you're all coked up like that, you can go for a while. You can go for quite a while. And, I mistook this guy's demeanor for charisma when it was nothing but cocaine.
Yeah. Well, it's easy mistake to make.
Well, yeah, it can be. And that it goes right back to what I've talked about before about all kinds of illnesses hiding within the pews. And sometimes they hide right behind the pulpit too. And you got to be careful. I don't think that there is any such thing as a safe church, but there are some that are safer than others. Now, all of that preamble goes back to what was in my head when I started all this. I can remember this guy, when it came time to take the offering, there was at least a 10-minute pep talk about the offering every single time. And he would pull out verse after verse about tithing. He would pull out verse after verse about free will offerings and why those are important. And this is what we're trying to do, and this is why you need to give us even more of your money. But he was also very adamant about give what you're supposed to or don't give. He was very, very specific about what he expected us to do. And I remember the phrase that he used all the time. Now, don't tip God. Don't tip God. God doesn't need your tip. He needs your loyalty and he needs your faith. And that is why a tithe is 10%, because you have to think about 10% and you have to trust that it's going to come back to you. So he didn't like the idea of us giving if it was less than 10%. So, a lot of times I didn't because I didn't have that amount of money on me. And at that point, I was only working a few hours a week at the student center. And the money that I was making, I'll go right on record. I wasn't tithing on it. I would give when I went home to church, to my home church. I would give there, but I wasn't giving to this guy. I was giving him my time, which actually is another provision with Old Testament tithing. If you really had nothing and you had no money, then you were required to give of your time. And in giving of your time, most of the time that meant that you were working in somebody's field, that you were doing something that was bringing in the produce. Okay. Right. You were helping to keep everybody else going. And that was another provision that was there. You could tithe with your time. Now, that was something that was also laid on me when I was in youth group, when I was a young person, because our youth pastor, again, very practical thinker, and he totally believed in the 10% thing. He absolutely did. But he also understood that there were those of us who felt left out if we didn't have jobs, if we didn't have some way of pulling in the cash to be able to pay that tithe. He said, well, we have these projects that we're working on right now, and this happens here on Wednesday nights, and this happens here on Tuesday nights, and whatever thing we were doing at the time, he would talk about how now we've got 50 or 60 people in this room, and consistently only 3 or 4 show up for these things. So think about that. If you don't have a job and you are concerned about how little you actually give, then stop thinking about your tithe in terms of money and start thinking about how you can spend at least 10% of your time doing something here. Mm-hmm. Now, that's all well and good until you break it down into real numbers. And if I want a gross blessing and not a net blessing, then I'm supposed to tithe on all of the money that I make. Well, does that mean that I have to tithe on all of my time? Because that's 16.8 hours a week.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, for me, I think I was pretty much doing that and above and beyond.
Yes.
But for the average person who was in that youth group meeting, they weren't doing anything close. And I don't even count the Tuesday night thing where I was taking Taekwondo. It just so happened that it was at the church, and it was run by a guy that started and ended it with prayer.
Right.
That's what differentiated it from any other Taekwondo class out there. There wasn't a whole lot of indoctrination as part of the overall class. We actually learned Taekwondo. And the guy who was teaching it for years. He was a good guy. He didn't seem like he was too mired in the Kool-Aid, but he was in it deep enough that we did that. We started and ended with prayer. For me, that was not really a spiritual discipline, but it was still within those walls. So you've got that vibe coming at you all the time. So did I consider that going to church? No, but I was there. Everything in my life revolved around it. So I was giving way, way more than a tithe's worth of my time. Mm-hmm. Between Wednesday nights when I had more to do on Wednesdays than the average, and I was teaching on Wednesdays a lot, especially when I was in my early 20s and when we were still around.
Right.
I was doing a lot on Wednesday nights. So that right there was a good chunk of it. Always Friday night for youth group. By the time I was out of college, peer care wasn't a thing anymore.
Right.
Thank goodness. If you want to know what peer care was, then you need to go back a couple of episodes. And what episode was that we were? That
was last episode.
In the Fear Factor?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So episode 7, we talk a little bit about peer care and what that entailed. Go back and listen. It's cringeworthy, but go back and listen. So again, the guy who wrote this book, what was the name? I'm going to plug him a couple of times because this is good stuff. And when a theist comes out with good ideas, I feel like, and again, there's a meat and bones aspect to this. It's not all great information, but it's practical and more practical than I would expect from a theist of any ilk. So again, The Tithing Dilemma by Ernest L. Martin. And there will be a direct link. The entire book is online. You can read it and you can listen to it because there's an MP3 version of this. So it's actually really good info if you cut out the stuff that he uses as proofs that deal directly with theistic dogma, like the atonement, how this affected it and blah, blah, blah. Just throw out all of that and read it from the standpoint of information. It's very, very, very good. Now, you had an interesting story that I think really, really encapsulates what the problem here is with the way that we view tithing. Because even when certain churches have the opportunity to do it right, they still drop the ball. Now, you had told me this story. Actually, you didn't tell me the story. I was there. I witnessed it. We were in Pittsfield at that time.
Right.
So
it was legit your story.
Yes. This directly involved me. But I want you to tell it because you were there too.
Right.
So.
But I remember that one of the supermarkets would give the church their day-old bread, like all the things that they had baked the day before that didn't get picked up or didn't get bought. They would give to the church, and that would be like loaves of bread, rolls, cakes, all sorts of things, and they were supposed to distribute that to poor people.
And what did they do instead?
Well, it's just sort of sat there.
A lot of it just sat there.
It just sort of sat there. And then occasionally somebody from the church, a congregant, or I don't even know who it was, they'd just come and take stuff.
Yeah. It was going to whoever was at the church that day.
Right.
And stuff would come in. I would go over to the store, get the stuff, bring it over there only to have people start rummaging through and putting aside what they wanted. Yeah. That's not why it was being given.
That wasn't the point. The problem is that is how the church views the tithe. It's something for the leadership to figure out what to do with. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to go to anybody in need. It just goes to the church.
And there are evidences of it going to places where it shouldn't. Now, my senior pastor, way back, the one that I did my internship with.
Right.
Now, he always drove nice cars. But to his credit, he didn't always buy new cars. As a matter of fact, he was the one that gave me the advice to always buy used cars. And there were different reasons for that. But one of the things that he brought up as to why he drove these cars, and he always drove a Cadillac. Now, there's a whole stereotype around that. And a lot of times I think that it's legit. I think that when you look at the car your pastor drives versus the cars that the average congregant drives, there's definite disparity there. So that's evidence of the money going into places where it shouldn't, because the tithe was never meant to benefit just the priests and clergy and all of that. But a lot of times you will see a real disparity between the vehicle that the pastor drives and the vehicle that the average pew sitter drives. There's usually a lot of disparity there. Oh, yeah. And it's evidence of where that money is really going. Now, he did make a good point, and I thought that this had some degree of validity. He said, when you buy a less expensive car, the odds of you getting more than like 5 years out of it. Now, this was a while ago. I think cars are, especially, I mean, I've got a car with about 120,000 miles on it right now, and I've never had a lick of trouble with it. But back then, I mean, the cars that we drove earlier on were good for maybe about 100,000 miles, and then things started going really, really wrong with them. So his attitude was, buy a better car, keep it for longer, and if I'm going to spend $30,000 on a vehicle, well, I'm going to have it for 3 times as long as your $10,000 vehicle. Right. So what difference does that really make? Well, the difference is in how it looks. Now, conversely, the last church that we went to in New York had the right idea. And he had even said to me at one point that he believed that the pastor's car should be a reflection of what was average in his congregation.
Right.
And this guy had two ancient Honda Civics, each of which had hundreds of thousands of miles on them.
Right.
But they still ran. So he still drove them. He didn't show up at church in a Range Rover. He didn't show up in an Escalade. No. He showed up in this rusty blue beater because a lot of the people in his blue-collar congregation drove rusty beaters. So he wanted to make sure that he was on level footing with the way that he was living. And I saw his house. I saw how he lived. He did have a side income that he actually got permission from the board to maintain, because with the extra money coming in, that would also afford him extra lifestyle.
Right.
So he wanted it disclosed that this was what he was doing with his time. He was the full-time pastor of this church, but he was also laying carpet and vinyl on the side, and he was very good at it. He actually had me work with him a couple of times, and it was timely because our money situation wasn't great at the time. I was only working at the radio station, and money was incredibly tight for us. So when he was offering me $10 an hour in, what was it, $19.95, $96
Yeah,
to
something like
work
that.
with him for an entire day, which was more like 12 or 16 hours.
Right.
It was a lot of money for me. So the few times that happened, I was really thankful that he thought about me for that. So he was using this side income as a discipleship tool, because I wasn't the only one that he brought out on jobs. This was a way that he bonded with a lot of new people who came into the church who had daytime time to spare. So he would bring us in and teach us a little bit about this. And his brother was also really, really good at it. And they were fun to be around. They were really down-to-earth types of people. And then something happened. I'm still not 100% certain on what all the circumstances were, but this guy flaked out to the point where he lost half of his congregation. And a lot of them wound up at my home church.
Yeah.
Which, says a lot about where that project was going, because it was a real ultra-modern sort of thing.
Yeah.
And Faith Assembly was not.
Yeah.
Faith Assembly was still a throwback to about 1955 until the time when the senior pastor that I knew for years was transitioning out, because he was very dyed-in-the-wool Pentecostal, and his idea of what was contemporary and what was effective was a good 30 years old at that point.
Yeah.
Okay. Just for the sake of example, there was one point where my youth pastor was getting a little frustrated with him because he actually wanted to spend some money doing a couple of different things. And our senior pastor's attitude was, well, I don't think that we really need to throw money at this right now because we're going to be doing this, 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 and this. But it was always things like gospel quartets that were coming in.
Yeah.
And he was under this really, really delusional impression that that was going to draw in young people. Why? Because that was the type of thing that drew in young people when he was that age.
Right.
Which was a long time before. It was at least 30 years before.
At least.
So in the 50s, gospel quartets were probably all the rage, and they probably did bring in the young people. But that wasn't going to work in 1992. It just wasn't. So his view of what was current and relevant was really, really, really off, which made it curious to me why people who came from the church that we were in and then gravitated over there. But by that point, things were starting to change. We were using a lot more modern worship music in church at that point. It had become the kind of visual medium that a lot of churches were turning into. And the first time I saw that in real wide use was at the last church that we went to. I suppose we can just say the name. It's no big deal. The place was called the River Church. I don't even know if they're still there. But
I don't know.
as far as the churches that we went to, I will also give this disclaimer. I found the most normal people there.
Yeah.
We actually enjoyed the midweek Bible studies, and there were home groups that we were involved in. And we always managed to get into groups with people that were at least as like-minded as we were, that we could get along with them, and we weren't hearing things during these gatherings that were appalling.
Right.
And I heard some very appalling things in some of these groups and had occasion to actually literally have to bite my tongue. Mm-hmm. Okay? So just to keep from getting into trouble in that small group. And again, way before anger management, I didn't have the tools at my disposal to be able to just sit there and smile and nod. It was a lot harder for me back then.
Yeah.
So we tended to gravitate toward people who thought more like we did. But since we're getting a little bit far off the subject, I want to pull it back, and I just want to talk, like I always do toward the end, to those of you who are listening who have specific ideas about what tithing is and what could happen to you if you stop. Well, here's what can happen to you if you stop tithing. If you stop tithing today, you'll have more money to work with. Your bills will get paid a little bit faster and a little bit easier. You might be able to afford to go out once in a while. You might be able to afford to have just some semblance of lifestyle. Because keep in mind, if you bring home a paycheck for 2 weeks, and I know for some this is going to sound tiny, but for some it's also going to sound huge. If you bring home a paycheck for 2 weeks and it's $1,000, that's $100. That's a nice dinner out. It really is. If I can manage the rest of my finances on the other 90%, then why can't I just do something for me with the rest of that money? At least I know where it's going. Okay. So you'll have more money to play with. You might have a little bit more lifestyle. You'll be less stressed because you won't be grudgingly writing that check or throwing that money into an offering plate and not knowing what the hell's going to be done with it. That was always the thing with me, was not knowing precisely where that money was going to be spent. I didn't mind that it was paying salaries for the people who ran the church. I didn't mind that it was being put toward the overhead in running a church service and keeping that building open. Those things didn't bother me. But there was very little disclosure as to where that money went until the annual business meeting, where you actually had to be a member to get copies of all of these numbers. So the average person sitting in the pew, I think legally had access to them, but it was only voluntarily shared with members. So the average person sitting in that pew was giving money all the time to the organization and having no clue where it was going. And yes, they absolutely could go and ask. And our senior pastor was very candid about this. If you want to know where our money is going and where it's being spent, we're more than happy to show you. And we're more than happy to explain to you what we're doing with your money. But, I mean, the average person isn't going to, they're not going to bother themselves with that.
Right.
They're going to do their spiritual duty, and that's going to be that. So if you stop tithing, I mean, the obvious thing that's going to happen first is that you're going to have more money. Now, what about for those in our audience for whom this is such an ingrained thing in their head that they can't get past the idea of not doing something with this money? Well, if you want to continue subsisting on the 90%, how about just opening up another account and taking that 10% and putting it in there and letting it do something for you? Okay? Yeah. There's nothing wrong with giving to something that you believe in. I will always advise against giving to the church for any reason whatsoever, but it all depends on what you think is worthwhile, because there are some things that the average church does that are worthwhile and that are worthy of the money that you spend on it. There are soup kitchens, there are clothing exchanges, there are all sorts of things that also require overhead to operate, and I don't see any problem with giving money to something that benefits the community. Why? Because that's what a tithe is supposed to be for. But I also think that it should be up to me how much, and I also think that it should be up to me where it's being spent. So if you feel like you have to give, then be selective about it. Give to things that you know are doing good for society and not just for what goes on between those four walls. Give in a manner that helps people, because that is what this concept is all about in the first place. It was what it was instituted for under Mosaic law, and it's what it's supposed to be for today. Other things, just take your pick. It's your money, and start looking at it as your money, because that was another thing that they used to do to us. They used to make us think of that 10% as being God's money. Well, what did God do to earn it? Well, he provided you with that job. Oh, really? I was the one on the interview. I mean, Yeah, God did not provide me with the job. I got the job because I went in there and I gave a good interview and I showed enough charisma and I showed enough knowledge, I guess, whatever they're looking for in an interview. It wasn't God that was showing it to them, it was me. So I got me that job. I was proactive enough to put in an application or send in a resume. I put on that shirt and tie and I went to that interview. That was all me. So what claim does this miscreant of a deity have on that money in the first place? The simple fact of the matter is that whether you are a theist or an atheist, if you just read the words in the book, it's easy to see that it has nothing to do with you giving money, period, end of story. And it has nothing to do with everyone in the pews having a responsibility to tithe. In every instance in the Old Testament where tithing was used as a means of sustaining a community, it was always about that and nothing more. Okay? So keep that in mind. And it was also only the responsibility of certain people to participate in tithing. So when your local church tells you that this is your duty as a Christian, then your first response to that should be, well, why? What is the biblical proof for this? When you ask the average Christian why they tithe, they're almost always going to refer to Malachi 3:10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. So this is where they get the whole thing about return on investment. But again, there's nothing here about money. What does it say? That there may be meat in mine house, and provide me now herewith. So when it says meat in my house and prove me now herewith. So basically, this is God saying, if you do this, then you're going to have this. And, you know, it's a veiled promise, but it is a promise. And it definitely talks about an increase and return on investment. Now, honestly, if this was really the way that it worked, then it would really work out in God's favor, because the more he gives you, the more you're going to have to give back. So isn't it in his best interest to keep this promise right here? Isn't it in his best interest to make sure that if you give $100 to the church, that somewhere down the line you get that $300, $700, or $1,000 that they talk about back? Wouldn't it be in his best interest? Because now I have to tithe on that $1,000, don't I? There's another 100 that's going to go out. So when they're explaining this, the logic just breaks down in a lot of different ways. Number one, the fact that you don't see those kinds of returns. I've never seen a 3, 7, or 10 times return on anything that I tithed on. And even in those small instances of found money, it never even came close to what was going out. You know, you find $20 in your pocket after your pants go through the wash. And, oh my goodness, look at this. Look at what God did. No, you already made that money. You forgot about it in your pocket. That's all. God didn't provide that. You worked for it. When you started working for Walmart, what were you making? Like $6 an hour?
Like $6.50.
Yeah.
I thought it was so much money.
And that was good for a retail job in that area at that time.
Oh, yeah.
So, but now you're not making $6 an hour. You're making $5.40. Because you have to account for that 60 cents when you're paying your tithe. So the way that they go about explaining the whys and wherefores make no sense even when you're sitting there reading the words, because you can't come up with a single instance where tithing with money is ever mandated anywhere. So what rules are you breaking if you decide that you're going to keep your money and do something better with it? Well, you're not breaking any law that was devised by any God, and certainly not Yahweh, because anything in the Old Testament, now keep in mind that if you are in this, you look at these words in here as the word of God. So God has never once told you as an individual to tithe with money. He told people who were producing to help other people who had less.
Right.
And the underlying concept here is that A, it benefits society on a whole, not just the local congregation, and it's given based on what you can afford. So the people that had these percentages placed on them, it was already known that they had it to give because they were the ones that were producing everything. So what can we ask them to give that isn't going to affect their lifestyle, but will help a lot of people? And in certain instances, it was 5%. In certain instances, it was 1/500th. In certain instances, it was 20%. But it was all situational. And at the end of the day, it was voluntary.
Right.
There's nothing in here about anyone being gone after to collect their tithe until you get into the book of Acts and we've got the Holy Spirit killing people for not bringing in their entire tithe. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, and that's also one verse. And if there's one thing that my youth pastor always pounded into me about biblical proofs, is that it has to be in more than one place.
Right.
And I don't see the Holy Spirit acting as an ecclesiastical hitman in any other circumstance than this one.
Yeah.
And that tells me that this story, or at least some of the details of this story, were probably added later by some redactor who thought that this was an important thing that Christians should be doing. So let's employ the fear factor. Mm-hmm. And let's insinuate that, you know what? If you withhold from God, he might kill you. Mm. And again, it goes right back to what we were talking about last week, how they use fear and intimidation to keep you in line. Well, I've heard that story told in the context of tithing more than once.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? I've never heard someone say from the pulpit that God will kill you if you don't tithe.
No.
But I did hear a good bit of God will get you if you don't.
Yeah.
Okay?
I have heard, your health will fail if you don't tithe. Things will happen to you, or you'll become disadvantaged in some way if you don't tithe.
Right. There was always the fatalistic aspect of it where, if you want to receive blessings, then you have to be proactive and you have to do this, that, and the other. I mean, it's a far cry from just believe and repent and be saved. There's so much that builds on that. So many things that they consider to be spiritual responsibilities that it just makes sense that this is one of the key areas that they would want to control. And there are several key areas of control that they need to clamp down on if they're really going to have you completely under their thumb. First, they try to monopolize your time. Mm-hmm. Then they try to dictate where you spend your money. And then they try to dictate how you use your private parts. Right. Okay? So if they can control where you go, if they can control what you do with your money, and they can control what you do with your body, what's left?
Right. What is left?
They've got you. Mm-hmm. And they know it. And that right there is why this is still such a big thing and why there's still such a heavy emphasis. I had mentioned talking a little bit about the way the Mormons do this. I'm going to leave that to the experts. But suffice it to say that the Mormon Church is one of a few, and they're not the only ones that do this, but they're the biggest one, and they've got the biggest stockpile of cash of any religious organization out there, probably except for the Catholic Church. I get the impression that the Catholics have a lot more money and assets tied up than anyone even knows about.
Right.
But at least there's a degree of transparency with the Mormons. And when I say transparency, I mean things have been found out. Mm-hmm. Not so much that they have volunteered anything, but there's been forced transparency on a lot of the things that they do. And they are militant about tithing to the point where I've heard tell of them actually going to people's houses to collect tithes. And in the less aggressive congregations, they allow you a grace period until the end of the year. But if you haven't paid on your tithe, everything comes due at the end of the year. It's called tithe settlement. Oy. Okay? So they're really, really, really serious about this. And they make sure that if you call yourself a Mormon, they make sure that you are doing this. Period. End of story. It is not something that is voluntary. It is mandatory. And you can show me absolutely no biblical precedent for that. I don't know about the Book of Mormon. I haven't read enough of it to be able to say what's in there about this. I'm going to leave the real heavy details to the actual experts. And again, I'll plug How to Heretic, because if you want to really get an idea of what happens in the Mormon church day to day, week to week, it's not the only thing they talk about, but they have a finger on the pulse and they talk about a lot of it. And they have talked in the past about the practice of tithing and how it is executed in the Mormon church. All I can say about that is that I was really lucky that I was where I was, because even though they were a little bit aggressive about it at times, there wasn't the kind of emphasis placed on tithing where we were that people were showing up at my house.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a lot of extreme examples out there, the Mormon church being a big one, but they're not the only ones that will use tithing as a weapon against people. Okay. So as a parting thought here, because I like to talk directly to the listener at the very end, aside from the benefits of just holding on to the money that you make, if you feel the need, and I touched on this a couple of minutes ago, but I'm going to take it just a little bit of a step further here, okay? If you feel the need to give, find organizations that you know are doing good for society, that put their financial reports out there for public consumption, know what the higher-ups in the organization are being paid, know what they're paying their board of directors if it's a nonprofit, and do your due diligence. Know where your money is going and where it's being spent. If you can't get away from this concept of I have to give something, and I know what it's like to have those thoughts so ingrained in your mind that it's something that you just can't not do anymore. I get that. But if you're one of those people, look at secular charities that are transparent about what they do with their money. Properly vet whoever you're going to give your money to, because there are organizations out there that are engaging in things that you really don't want to be supporting. I won't go into specifics, but there are charities, one in particular, that should be very near and dear to our hearts because of certain circumstances in our life. But there are large charities out there that are purported to work with people on the autism spectrum. And I don't think I have to say the name of this one because it's the biggest one out there. But when you research an organization and find out that autistic people don't want you giving money to them, then you know that it's time to move along.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about just autism charities, but if that's something that is important to you, then look into the different ones that are out there. Look into the different ones that are out there for whatever your cause of choice might be. Whether it's, I don't know, diabetes or cancer research or anything along those lines that has a direct benefit on society. National food banks, things that are run by organizations that will tell you this is how much money we spent actually feeding people this year. And also don't think that because a charity is large that they are reputable. A lot of them are backed by theistic organizations like the Salvation Army. And if you do a little bit of digging on them, you'll find some very interesting information that may or may not motivate you to give or not give to them. And there are plenty of others like that. I don't want to just put one organization in the crosshairs because there are plenty of them out there that have a very pretty face that look like they're doing good for society that really aren't. So know where your money is going. Feel good about the money that's going out. So give what you are comfortable giving. Give to organizations that are doing good for society. And with all due respect, the more money that you take away from the local church, the more of a chance you have of doing real good in the world, and the more of a chance you have of helping more people get and stay unbound. And that's true for a couple of reasons. Number one, because you're not contributing to something that you know is steering people in a bad direction. And you are doing something that you know is going to do good for people. That's going to start freeing up your own mind about what you're doing with your money. And it's going to start freeing up your own mind about the amounts, because guess what? There will be times when you won't be able to give as much as you want, and you don't need to feel guilty about it. Give what you can, and if that amount this week is nothing, then don't feel bad about giving nothing, okay? If you're still going to church and you're still dealing with that plate passing in front of you and you have anxiety about it, consider going to a church that doesn't pass the plate as a first course of action, because there's plenty of them out there. They still hit you up for money for other things, but at least you don't have that anxiety in the middle of the service. You know what I mean? So if you're not ready to make that leap out of faith yet, then at least find some place that takes a little bit more practical approach to this and doesn't keep cramming the concept of tithing down your throat every week. Doing that alone is going to help center your brain a little bit more on what you should be doing with your money and making better decisions about it. And the better decisions that you start making right now about how you spend your money, the better a financial place you're going to be in later, because you'll learn how to manage the 100 just as well as you were able to manage the 90. And if you handle that money the right way, you're going to find yourself unbound in a lot of other ways, not just spiritual ways, but you'll also have your bills paid. You'll also have money to have a little bit of lifestyle, so you'll be a little bit happier. And the happier you are with where you're at, the easier it is to see things more clearly and logically. And you can start thinking about the situation that you're in, the environment that you're in, and wonder what else they might have lied to you about. Because if what they're telling you about tithing isn't true, guess what? There are plenty of other things that they're telling you that aren't true either. And that is why we're here. Because the more you know and the more you understand, the easier it is to get and stay unbound. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Unbound. Show topics are chosen based on their timeliness, relevance, and social impact. Have suggestions for future topics? Email us at unbound.podcast.network@gmail.com with all your comments and feedback. Please don't forget to like, share, and throw a few 5-star ratings our way, and follow us on all major social platforms. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Links to our social pages, as well as a full list of cited sources in today's episode, are listed in the show notes, available at our website, getunbound.org. That's get-unbound.org. If you value this resource and would like to see it continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon at the link in the show description. And be sure to check for new updates every Sunday when we'll come together again and take one more step toward getting and staying unbound.